The containment field dropped at 3:47, and I was the one watching the telemetry when it happened, so I am the one who has to write this report. I want that understood before anything else. I am not writing this because I was assigned to. I am writing it because 3 other physicians watched the same readings I did, and none of them can agree with me on what we saw, and someone has to put a flag in the ground. The test chamber sits 200 meters below the observation bay, a sealed dome built to run whether we are not foolish enough to run anywhere near a living crew. We had been cycling baseline atmospheric subjects through it for 6 weeks, pressure ranges, humidity curves, simple storm patterns to calibrate our new long-range climate models before we tried to terraform anything. The human, a contract technician named Calder Ames, had been in the chamber 11 minutes for what should have been a 14-minute baseline read. Heart rate, respiration, core temperature, cortisol marker, nothing exotic. He was sitting on a maintenance bench eating from a ration pack when the field failed. I heard the alarm before I understood what it meant. The containment lattice, which should have held a manageable squall, had been quietly degrading along 3 support nodes for weeks, a manufacturing flaw none of us had caught, and at 3:47 it let go all at once. What came through the breach was not the squall we'd scheduled. It was the storm cell we had queued behind it, the one rated for unmanned structural testing only, the one with wind shear values we had never run with anything alive inside. Senior physician Doran Wex was beside me at the secondary console. "Pull him," he said. "Pull him now." "The lift shaft's flooding," I said. "The chamber's drainage couldn't keep pace with what was coming down. We can't open the hatch without venting the whole storm into the access corridor." "Then we wait it out and we pull him when it breaks." 11 minutes became 11 hours. I want to be precise about that, because precision is the only thing I have left to offer. His heart rate at the moment of containment failure was 71 beats per minute. I remember because I had just logged it as his resting baseline. By the first hour, wind inside the chamber had reached speeds that would have stripped insulation from a hull plate. Calder had taken shelter against the lee side of an equipment housing, knees drawn up, forearms over his head. Debris, loose panel screws, a torn section of mesh flooring battered the housing hard enough that the impact sensors logged structural stress. I watched his heart rate climb to 84 and hold there. 84. I checked the sensor twice. A Vethic body under that wind load, that noise floor, that proximity to flying debris would already be past 120. The fight response alone should have carried him there in under a minute. "Equipment fault," said junior physician Errol Sen at my left. "Run a diagnostic," Wex told her, and she did twice and both came back clean. By the second hour, the chamber's internal temperature had dropped to -4 degrees. As the storm pulled cold air down from the upper baffles we'd built to simulate altitude. Calder was visibly shivering on the feed. We could see that much through the one camera the storm hadn't yet torn loose, but his respiration rate stayed in a band I would call, on any other subject, restful. 14 breaths a minute. Slow, even, through a storm that should have had him hyperventilating from cold shock alone. I started a second monitor just to be sure the first wasn't lying to me. They matched. By the third hour, lightning began arcing inside the chamber, a phenomenon our engineers swore was impossible at that scale, but the friction load from the debris field had apparently built enough static charge to discharge across the dome's internal ribs. One strike landed close enough to throw Calder sideways off the bench he'd repositioned to. We watched him go down. We watched him not get up for 4 full seconds, and every one of us in that observation bay held still with him. His heart rate in those 4 seconds rose to 91. Then he stood up, checked his own forearm where the bench edge had caught him, and went back to the lee side of the housing. "That cannot be the response curve," said the auditor. I had nearly forgotten she was in the room. Calibrate Authority sends an observer to any facility running unscheduled containment failures, and ours had arrived 2 days prior for an unrelated equipment review, which meant she watched the entire 11 hours standing at the rear console with her hands clasped behind her back, saying almost nothing until that moment. "Define cannot," Wex said. He did not look back at her. None of us could look away from the monitors long enough to be polite. "I have reviewed 400 Vethic stress response curves in this facility alone," she said. "Lightning proximity at that range produces a sympathetic spike that does not resolve inside 90 seconds. His resolved in 11. He's not Vethic." "I am aware of what he is not. I am asking what he is." None of us answered her, because none of us knew, and I think that silence is the part of this report I am least proud of. By the 4th hour, the wind had begun to gust past the threshold our models called catastrophic, strong enough that we logged 2 more structural alarms on the housing Calder sheltered behind. He had, by then, wedged a torn section of mesh flooring into a makeshift windbreak, working with what I can only describe as patience, as though he were arranging furniture rather than fighting for the integrity of a shelter in a storm built to test unmanned hulls. His hands, on the close-up feed, did not shake. Not from cold, not from adrenaline. They moved the way a technician's hands move when bolting down an access panel on an ordinary shift. His heart rate at hour 4, 79. It had come down. "Run the diagnostic again," Sen said to no one, and ran it herself a 3rd time. Clean. By the 5th hour, the chamber's internal pressure had begun cycling unpredictably as the storm interacted with the dome's failing baffles, producing pressure swings that should have triggered ear and sinus trauma severe enough to disorient any subject without specialized conditioning. We watched Calder press the heel of his hand briefly against one ear during a sharp swing, wince, and then continue securing the windbreak he'd built. His blood oxygen saturation dipped 2 points and recovered within 90 seconds. Between the 5th and 6th hour, Sen pulled the facility's full historical archive on storm chamber failures, every recorded incident across our outposts, 11 years of data, looking for a single precedent that matched what she was watching. She found 3 incidents involving live subjects. In all 3, the subject lost consciousness within 90 minutes of containment failure. In all 3, the report's final line was a time of death. "There's no 4th case to compare him to," she said. "He's not an outlier on our chart. He's not on the chart at all." "Then widen the chart," Wex said, "or admit the chart was never built to hold him." By the 6th hour, hypothermia should, by every chart I had access to, have begun degrading his motor coordination. His core temperature had fallen to a level that, cross-referenced against any of our own physiology, predicted confusion, slowed reflexes, slurred fine motor control within the hour. Instead, he reorganized his shelter a 2nd time, redirecting the windbreak's angle as the storm's primary vector shifted 40 degrees. He did this without hesitation, as though he had simply noticed the wind had changed and adjusted for it the way a person adjusts an umbrella. I logged his respiration that hour, 13 breaths a minute. "He should be dying," Sen said quietly. She wasn't being dramatic. She was reading the same models I was. "He's not behaving as though anything is happening to him at all," Wex said, and for the first time in 6 hours, I heard something other than clinical flatness in his voice. By the 7th hour, the storm produced its single worst structural failure. The housing Calder sheltered behind buckled along one seam under a wind gust our sensors logged at a magnitude we had never cleared for crude testing. The collapse exposed him directly to open wind for nearly 11 seconds before he was able to drag the windbreak mesh fully around himself again. His heart rate during those 11 seconds, 88. It had not even then crossed 90. I want to be honest about what that number did to me, sitting at that console. I have spent 31 years monitoring stress physiology. I have watched soldiers under fire, patients in surgical shock, infants in respiratory distress. I know what a body does when it believes, correctly, that it might die in the next few seconds. I have never, not once, not in any species I have charted, watched a number simply refuse to go where the situation demanded it go. It wasn't suppression. Suppression has a cost. It shows up somewhere else on the chart. A spike deferred and paid for later in cortisol, in tremor, in some compensating system working overtime to hold the line. There was no compensating system. There was no line being held. There was simply no line to hold in the first place. He is not enduring this, I said finally to the room. Endurance has a signature, this has none. The auditor wrote something down. It was the first note she had taken in 3 hours. By the 8th hour the storm began, gradually, to lose intensity, not because our systems were correcting it, but because the cell itself was approaching the natural end of its programmed cycle, the one designed for unmanned structural fatigue testing, the one none of us had ever expected to run against something that breathed. By the 9th hour, wind speeds had dropped enough that Calder could stand fully upright without bracing. He did, stretched once, the way a person stretches after sitting too long at a desk, and resumed checking the housing's collapsed seam with the mild, unhurried attention of someone assessing whether a fence needed mending. By the 10th hour, the lightning had stopped, the temperature had begun climbing back towards survivable, and the drainage system finally caught up enough that Wex gave the order to open the hatch. We brought him up at the 11-hour mark. His core temperature had recovered to within 2 degrees of baseline before he reached the lift. His heart rate, the entire walk from the chamber floor to the medical bay, sat at 76. He looked tired. I want to note that, because it is the only normal thing about the entire reading. He looked like a man who had pulled a long, uncomfortable shift, not a man who had spent 11 hours inside a storm cell rated to destroy unmanned hulls. "You're cold," I said, because it was the only useful clinical observation I had left in me. "Bit yeah." He rubbed his forearm where the bench had caught him earlier. "Could have used a thicker jacket." The auditor stepped forward before I could ask anything else. 11 hours, she said. Lightning proximity, structural collapse, pressure cycling. Hypothermic threshold breached for at least 4 of those hours. Your heart rate did not exceed 90 at any logged interval. Explain that to me. He thought about it, actually thought, the way a person considers a question they haven't been asked before, not the way a person stalls for an answer they're embarrassed to give. "I don't know," he said. "I just kept doing the next thing. Fix the windbreak, check the seam, wait it out. Wasn't much else to do." That is not a physiological explanation. "No," he agreed, "guess it isn't." She looked at the 3 of us, me, Wex, Sen, as though one of us might offer the explanation he hadn't. None of us did. I had spent 11 hours staring at a number that would not rise to meet a situation that, by every model I had ever trusted, demanded it rise, and the only honest thing I could tell her was that the body sitting in front of us had simply never agreed to panic, and had apparently never needed to be told twice. She filed her report the next morning. I have read it. It uses the word anomalous 4 times and reaches no conclusion. I understand why. I reached the same place she did by a longer road. What I wrote in my own log, the one nobody but Wex and Sen will ever see, was simpler than hers. We built our entire model of survival around the idea that fear is what keeps a creature alive, the spike, the surge, the body screaming at itself to move or freeze or run. Calder Ames sat in a collapsing storm chamber for 11 hours and never once let his body make that argument. Not because he couldn't feel it. Because some part of him, somewhere below the numbers I know how to read, had already decided fear wasn't going to be useful in that chamber, and simply declined to spend any of it. I do not know what to chart that as. I only know what I told the technician who relieved me at the end of that shift, when he asked me how the human subject had done. I told him the storm tried for 11 hours. The man's pulse never noticed.